My name is Iona Malek, and on behalf of the Future Partners Forum, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to present our ideas. The ideas we were discussing on that moment on February the 22nd when the earthquake struck. In the hours, days and weeks that followed that moment, we have seen the partnership of our two countries in action in response to this crisis. Moments like this remind us of how interconnected we really are. Our swift response to this disaster shows us that we can act urgently and effectively in the face of immediate crises. We face a series of challenges that will require the same dedication and unity of action. However, these are slow motion crises that require both long-term planning and urgent action. Why is it that we can respond so effectively to earthquakes but not to extreme poverty, to tsunamis but not to climate change, to the immediate need for food and water but not to long-term pressures on our global resources? Such long-term issues require long-term solutions. Intergenerational problems require intergenerational leadership. We challenge you to think of us not just as future partners, but as current partners. These slow motion crises require action now. In order to do this, we will present what we believe is necessary to address these crises, a redefinition of success. We will then outline how this works at a global, bilateral and domestic level, looking at 3 specific examples relevant to the US-NZ partnership. We recognise that there are many issues for us to consider, but we see this as the beginning of a conversation we must continue in the coming months and years. Our first point is that in order to find solutions, we need to define success. Real success is not determined solely by economic growth. Real success means an inclusive and equitable society. It means a healthy and sustainable environment. It means long-term thinking rather than election cycle mentality. Real success means bringing multiple voices to the table and actually listening to them. In this vein, you're about to hear 3 examples of slow-motion crises that demand this new approach. Ali Bors will examine potential solutions to climate change. Patrick Barrow will tackle poverty through the lens of trade agreements. And Ali Nagairote will explore the unique US-NZ opportunity to address social inequities. Ali.
Thank you, Iona. Pervading all aspects of our lives, climate change embodies the concept of a slow-motion crisis in this truest sense. Our response must be immediate. Over the last couple days and in Christchurch, we've had a wide range of discussions on the topic. Today, I will address renewable energy and sustainability in business, the shared challenges of climate change in the Pacific, and the role of the US-NZ partnership. Renewable energy is valuable as both an environmental ideal and an economic opportunity. Embracing new technologies and energy potentials will enable both the public and the private sector to drive long-term solutions to some of our greatest environmental challenges. Unlike the current industry status quo, renewable energy offers the potential to develop jobs that will persist after we reach the environmental tipping point. The US and New Zealand share a spirit of entrepreneurial endeavor. We have so much potential for interdisciplinary work, and there's such a creative spark just in this room and in both countries. I want to talk a little bit about innovation. Innovation can come from surprising places. One small example that we want to discuss is a company called Whale Power. Whale Power was started by a gentleman named Dr. Frank Fish, believe it or not, who observed the shape of a whale's flipper and thought about windmills that we design for harvesting wind power. He noticed that the flipper was shaped in a very different way than we usually design these turbine blades, and he wondered if it was more efficient than what humans had come up with. It turns out that by designing the blades a new way, followed by this design of the flipper, that it's 40% more efficient. He designed 40% more efficient windmills. This is an amazing, I think, example of innovation and creativity that was then turned into a business enterprise and can now help us in battling climate change. And in fact, it's a really good example of interdisciplinary work and cooperation. Business leaders must shift their thinking to extend the bottom line past profits and towards sustainable economies. This will involve business plans that incorporate the environmental context in which we operate. Climate change has a particular impact on the Pacific. As Pacific partners, the US and New Zealand share challenges with Pacific Island nations that are facing the impact of rising sea level and land loss and will soon be displaced. We need to include their voices in our planning and our long-term vision of adaptation. Our future society must foster cultural plurality. The potential for US and New Zealand leadership is everywhere. It's in this room, it's outside this room, it's in both nations. Specifically, in the private sector, businesses can include sustainability in their bottom line and promote creativity and innovation in technology and engineering. In the public sector, we can collaborate on issues surrounding displaced peoples. Instead of dwelling on our inability to achieve consensus during climate negotiations, let's ask ourselves why New Zealand and the US can't achieve consensus in the interest of the global environment and the global community and strive to move forward.
Thank you, Ellie. The reasons why climate change is a global crisis are obvious. The reasons why poverty is a global crisis are less so. Climate change is invisible, climate change does not directly affect people, and climate change is a very technical problem. Global poverty is none of these things. It directly affects people every day in a very visible fashion. There are 2 billion people living in poverty today. By 2020, that number will increase to 3 billion people. This is a crisis that is equally as important for our generation as global climate change. So what do we do about it? We need to address global poverty with the same sense of urgency which we address global climate change. It means not just redefining success, but it also means taking responsibility and recognizing all of the implications and all of the effects of our global trade agreements. As a result, global trade agreements must be reoriented to promote development and to lead to the reduction of poverty. Today, global trade agreements are focused primarily on profits and are focused primarily on profits in the developed world. Applying our definition of success to global trade agreements, we would like to see a trade agreement in which trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff, are completely eliminated. In effect, this means that countries eliminate trade barriers to trade for goods coming from countries with lower GDPs and lower per capita GDPs than in the country with the trade barriers. Why this is a benefit to developing countries is very obvious. Developing countries gain access to the markets of developed countries, and they retain control over their domestic industry. Why developed countries should get behind an idea like this, or why they would get behind an idea like this, requires a long-term view of the problem. 30 years ago, the leaders of that generation showed an incredible amount of initiative when they went to China and they helped China open to the West. Today, our leaders are reaping the benefits of that action. Today, Starbucks makes more money off of its branches in Shanghai than they make off of their branches in New York City. By 2015, they will triple their presence in China. The leaders of today have the opportunity to make the same kind of leadership decisions with respect to our generation. If they reorient trade towards development, they will increase markets in 30 years. They will lead to economic benefit for both the people who are developing and the developed world. Actions by the developed world to reorient trade policy is not just an investment in equity, it's not just an investment in the developing world, it's an investment in the global future that will pay dividends for our generation. The first step in this process is a bilateral agreement between New Zealand and the United States in which the United States takes the initiative and eliminates trade barriers with respect to New Zealand goods. This means all barriers. It doesn't just mean tariffs, it means subsidies, it means indirect subsidies, all kinds of protectionism. In turn, New Zealand and the United States must include labor protections in their trade agreements that allow the losers from trade, those who become unemployed when their industry leaves a country, to gain just as much as the winners from trade. This means re-education policies, relocation policies, policies that help the losers, and they can be financed in part by the gains of the winners. It's spreading equity across the domestic branch as well as the international branch. Trade is not just about international equity, it's about domestic equity as well. Finally, because New Zealand gains from trading with the United States, they need to recognize that they have a responsibility to do the same thing with respect to their trade to other countries in the Pacific. If the United States is going to take the initiative and eliminate trade barriers with respect to New Zealand goods, New Zealand must follow in that initiative and eliminate trade barriers with respect to goods from the developing countries in the Pacific. This helps to eliminate poverty in the Pacific, it helps to spread equity across the Pacific, and it leads to a better future for both New Zealand and the Pacific. As a result, we see trade as a tool for development, not just for the development of the developed world. Using trade as a tool for development provides an opportunity for the leaders of today to make a statement going forward that they want to see a world that is equitable, a world that's sustainable, a world that protects the environment, and a world in which everyone's opinions are heard. And that's the only type of trade agreement that will be considered successful in the future.
Good afternoon, everyone. When having these conversations about things like climate change and trade, particularly at an international and bilateral level, we tend to think of the US and New Zealand as these homogeneous entities with homogeneous interests. Yet this approach often overlooks the rich diversity within each of our countries, and particularly ignores the persistent and systemic racial and gender inequities that continue to face our countries in our own backyards. Yet these inequities rarely make it onto the agenda of our bilateral conversations. We believe this needs to change. Here's how. Placing our shared challenge of domestic inequity on our bilateral agenda. And two, in all decision-making contexts, in both domestic and bilateral realms, re-evaluating the process of including and engaging marginalized groups. Both the US and New Zealand have populations that are dramatically shifting in terms of the socio-cultural demographics, and are increasingly becoming more ethnically and racially diverse. In the next 30 to 40 years, both New Zealand and the US will become majority-minority countries. This is an opportunity. We don't need to explain to you the value of diversity. We know that you get that. However, underlying this is a huge crisis. There are major disparities in health, education, employment, incarceration rates. For example, Maori and Pacific youth have disproportionately high unemployment rates at 27%. Compare that to 16% for the overall youth population. In the States, African American youth unemployment stands at 33%, and the Latino American youth unemployment rate is 22%. These inequities and many others are embedded into our social and political structures. With increasing diversity in our population demographics and these persistent socioeconomic inequities and disparities, this is a prime example of the slow-moving crisis. Remember for a moment the role that youth unemployment had in Egypt and Tunisia. Addressing these inequities needs to be a priority for both of our countries. And as my colleagues have mentioned, urgent action is required now. We could choose to think of these things as a problem, but let us take a long-term approach in our thinking and see it as an opportunity to proactively address inequity and engage marginalized groups as part of our solution. The US and New Zealand, as we know, have many shared values. And it is our shared values and the similar challenges that we face in addressing these persistent inequities that gives us an amazing opportunity to collaborate and work together in terms of sharing our best practices to address this. At the bilateral level, we need to put this issue on our metaphoric agenda, where we see tackling inequity as a priority. In the Pacific Partners Report, there's reference to social inequities, but it also comes under an appendix. We would argue that needs to be one of the primary pieces of the conversation in one of the main chapters. In all decision-making contexts, in both the domestic and bilateral realms, shifting our definition of success means being intentional about including people at the proverbial decision-making table, and re-evaluating the process of including people at that table. And I'll say that again. This means including people, being intentional about including people at the table, and re-evaluating the process about the way in which we include those people. This means meaningfully engaging people in setting the agenda, setting the terms of the conversation, and in defining our collective priorities. Think for a moment about your own organizational settings. In your boardrooms, in your executive sessions, who are the people sitting around you at the table? Who are the people who are making the decisions? What are the assumptions underpinning What are the assumptions underpinning the framing of your organizational priorities? Our guess is that marginalized groups, particularly women, young people, and racial minorities, are not in those agenda-setting roles. An example, only 2.5% of US Fortune 500 companies have women CEOs. New Zealand is slightly better, where 9% of directorship positions are held by women. But really, we're not talking about a numbers game. It's not just about the number of women CEOs we have or the number of African American or Maori folks we have around our board tables. And while that is important, while we do need to increase those numbers, what we're really talking about is how do we meaningfully engage people in that conversation and in that decision-making process. An example, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, we cannot wait until the agenda and the text of the agreement has been set in order to involve iwi leadership. We can't just consult groups after the fact once things have been decided and ask them to sign off on what has already been decided. Similarly, how are we engaging young people in this conversation? What does true intergenerational leadership on this issue look like? Let this not be the end of our interactions. Let this be the beginning. Bring us to the table as equal partners and delegates on an ongoing basis. Rather than being reactive to our changing demographics, let's take the opportunity to be proactive by truly valuing diversity through inclusion, from both top-down and bottom-up initiatives. This is not about a box that we check off our list of things to do, and rather than being an obstacle, let us see this as an opportunity for new perspectives, innovative thinking, and forward-looking good practice. Both the US and New Zealand can be role models for this globally as we face similar challenges and share similar values. We can demonstrate partnership in addressing persistent socioeconomic inequalities in meaningful and impactful ways.
As you can see, while these are significant and complex problems, they do have solutions, but these solutions require us to act now. We invite you, we need you to join us in this intergenerational partnership and begin the conversation. As such, we would now like to open the floor for dialogue, and we'd appreciate it if you could preface your comments with a short introduction. Thank you.